Thank you, Shelley. We are continuing in our study of the letter to the Philippians, and we have a special treat this morning because we have two of our longtime mission partners, Vic and Leslie Troutwine, who for 22 years have been in the Dominican Republic, who are in town this weekend. And we have a chance to hear from them. I'm going to interview them, and it's in the context, in the framing of our passage this morning. So our passage, if you want to open it up on your devices or in the Bibles in front of you, is from Philippians chapter 2, and it's verses 12 to 18. Remember that Paul is writing to a congregation that is one of the congregations he's closest to. Paul is out in the field as a missionary, and he is currently in prison, and he's writing to a group of people, a family of believers who he absolutely trusts are continuing the work, the mission of announcing and embodying the gospel of Jesus Christ in the city of Philippi. And here's what he writes in these verses. He says this: "Therefore, my beloved, just as you have always obeyed me, not only in my presence, but much more now in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who is at work in you, enabling you to both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Do all things without murmuring and arguing, so that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, in which you shine like stars in the world. It is by your holding fast to the word of life that I can boast on the day of Christ, that I did not run in vain or labor in vain. But even if I am being poured out as a libation over the sacrifice and the offering of your faith, I'm glad and rejoice with all of you. And in the same way, you also must be glad and rejoice with me." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So here, even from the beginning of these verses, you can see this relationship between Paul and the Philippians. He calls them his beloved. He's absolutely confident that no matter what he faces in the field, which at the moment is imprisonment, his brothers and sisters in Philippi are continuing to pray for him and do gospel work. And I love this phrase, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. Now we know Paul. We know from everything that the Apostle Paul wrote that there's nothing in here that suggests that, okay, now that you have this gift of salvation, get your sorry act together and earn it. This is not what Paul is saying. That's just not how Paul works. But what he is saying, quite realistically, is that living this salvation out in the world, a world that will fight the word of life and the gospel of Christ in the world, is the hardest and best work you will ever do. This is the hardest and best work you're ever going to do. So live out this salvation, walk in the way of the gospel, work out this salvation with awe, with reverence, with the reliance on Jesus Christ, who has been exalted to the right hand of God the Father Almighty, as we heard just earlier in this chapter, and one day will return, and one day every knee will bow and tongue confess that this Jesus Christ is Lord. And with that being the case, that's where our fear and trembling goes. Not with every other threat that is around us. We live in awe of that name and that authority who is and will return. And Paul is so absolutely confident that his brothers and sisters in Philippi are going to be doing this where they are as they face challenges, that it gives him rejoicing and joy where he is. He says this in verse about not laboring in vain, so that I can boast, verse 16, on the day of Christ, that I did not run in vain or labor in vain. He uses that term boasting a lot in this letter. It's another term for confidence. In the middle of prison, in the midst of everything else that's going on, Paul says, hey, you know what? You give me so much confidence that this hasn't been a waste. that me putting my whole life into the work of the gospel is not in vain. It's bearing fruit. It's bearing fruit because of your obedience. You're continuing to work out your salvation in fear and trembling and awe of Jesus Christ, of your work alongside me in the gospel. And that rejoicing and gladness and boasting is reciprocal. They also rejoice in Paul and are glad in Paul. Now, as we came up on this passage, it struck me we have Vic and Leslie in town. And this relationship of these two fellow co-workers in the gospel who are out in the field in the Dominican Republic and have been for 22 years is a sort of mutual relationship, the dynamics of it, that Paul's also talking about in his letter to the Philippians. So I'm going to invite Vic and Leslie up. We're going to do something that I've never done yet at this church. We're going to spend most of the sermon in a conversation with Vic and Leslie. Not so much about their current work, the current work that they're doing in the Dominican Republic. They will catch people up on in the reception that is after this service. But everything, go ahead and take a seat, you guys. Everything that God did to call them into this work and to continue to encourage them in this work, and the way that this church family at Westside has participated in this. So hi, Vic and Leslie.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
Some of you know Leslie and Vic. Oh, that's good. Some of you waved. That's very nice. You should all give a wave to Vic and Leslie. So I think there are a lot of people here, myself included. I had never had an opportunity to sit down and learn your story and learn what God did in your life until just the other day. And once we started talking, I'm like, oh, I'm going to save all my sermon stuff for next week from this passage, and we're doing this week because this is just too encouraging to hear your story and everything that's going on. So you have been 22 years with Kids Alive in the Dominican Republic. The Kids Alive has grown to serve over 2,500 children and youth that come from vulnerable situations. They do this through 7 holistic care schools, 3 residential programs, and an independence program that includes 80 university scholarships. And Vic, you serve as the co-country director and director of operations. And Leslie, you oversee medical care and communications and use your medical training down there. But I kind of want to go into the way back machine. And now that at this point, you've raised 4 children out in the fields. You've launched 4 young adults into their life back here in the States. And our mission field here as a congregation at Westside is especially passionate about how do we identify and equip and launch leaders into gospel leaders into the world from these different age groups. So can we go back even your own lives? You both grew up in Presbyterian churches, right? Found yourselves at Dartmouth College. And so what did life look like in your journey there? Once you left those Presbyterian churches you grew up in, where did God get your attention? What happened there? Why don't we start with you, Leslie?
Well, I had come to Christ probably really young and then made a public kind of profession when I was in junior high in California, where I grew up mostly. And
did you mostly grow up in California? Like you mostly grew up, or mostly you were in California growing up?
I still think I'm growing up, so I still have lots to grow up. But I was born in California and lived up and down the coast. We were in Oregon for 3 but very formative years. I love the rain. But in that time, when I was 5, I said I want to be a doctor, and my dad said, that's great, thinking she will not starve. He grew up very poor, and I'm the oldest in my family. And along the way, God, we would go into San Francisco occasionally for a theater or a ballet, and I would see people living on the streets, and my heart went out to them, and there was this illogical thing. We were going to something that was extra, something that I was fed, I was sheltered, and this was an extra cost, and there were people that didn't have basics, and that just sat in my heart. And I believe that's just something God just started weaving together in me with medicine and just seeing the marginalized and underserved. And so when I got to Dartmouth, I knew I was in a place that was secular. And so I found the one Christian organization, which was Campus Crusade for Christ.
Right.
Dove deep into that, and that was an anchor throughout those years. I was involved in some other things like
yeah.
Like,
It's so encouraging to remember that God is doing things in our kids' hearts that that we have
Definitely.
no idea, right? Your parents didn't take you into San Francisco thinking, oh, and this will give a chance for God to work in her heart, a lifetime vocation. But that attentiveness that from very early ages, that's what God's doing in the life of our kids. And that carried all the way through with you to start with. And then you guys met through rugby.
Correct.
Do they look like
Something
rugby
like
players? This was a surprise to me. I did not expect you to say you met through rugby. But what was going on with your faith journey, Vic?
Well, mine's a little different than Leslie's. I also grew up in a Presbyterian church in a suburb of Chicago, but church was kind of a family thing. So we went every Sunday, and I went to the Sunday schools, and I learned things about God, but I didn't have a personal relationship with God. And when I remember that in 8th grade, we memorized the Great Commission. I still use the King James Version in my head. But when I went to college, I stopped going to church because I wasn't with my family anymore. And for those years, I was further away from God and not really living for God at all, but kind of following things of the world. I was still a good student, but it wasn't important to me. But that changed really drastically, and I'm thankful to God for my upbringing because I knew something about Him, and I was connected with people who were believers. But when I was 26, I was going into my second year of business school at Stanford, and my mom suddenly passed away. And I hadn't been at home for years, but she was important in my life because she was how I understood selfless love. And when she passed away suddenly, and I was with her. She had been in a coma for about a month, and I was home when she was dying, and I just that very day I decided I had this vision of Christ, and I needed to live not for what pleases my parents, but for what pleases God, and it renewed my faith, and it started my personal relationship with Christ. And what's interesting is that I knew Leslie in college. We were friends. We played rugby on different. She was on the women's team. And the
I did
men's
not
team.
play with the men, to be clear.
But it wouldn't have been appropriate for us to date because she was following Christ and I wasn't. But at this point in time, we were still in touch a little bit. And about a year later, after I started following Christ, we started dating. And a year after that, or 2 years after that, within 3 years we were married, and it was God's perfect timing in that as well. And so God works at different times in different people's lives, but that's my story.
To bring you around, and so and not only that, so you were married and you both ended up here in West Seattle. You're with Weyerhaeuser,
Correct.
Vic, and Leslie, you were doing a fellowship as an ER doctor over at Harborview Medical Center, and I understand you moved to West Seattle because you're sea kayakers, and so you could get into the water, right? But then what ended you up in West Side Presbyterian Church?
That's God's story as well. So I had been living on Queen Anne Hill, but when Leslie and I were just getting married, it was actually 30 years ago last month, 1994, and she was moving up here from San Francisco, and we decided we should buy a house. And we looked in West Seattle because it was convenient for work for both of us, and we were sea kayakers. And so we found this house on 41st Street, 2 blocks away from here. And after
we're not going to ask you what the house cost 30 years ago.
Oh my
we
gosh.
don't want to know that. That would be too
owned it.
painful.
We drive by it and we're like, oh.
Carry on though. So you were in your house.
No, and so the first, we get back from our honeymoon, and we're moved into the house, and we're going to go to church. And I knew there was a Presbyterian church here, but Leslie's not feeling well, so I walked over to church on my own. And remember I walked after church. I met Paul Smith and liked the sermon, felt really welcome, and I came back home and said, I think I found a church for us. And I think I probably filled out one of these Connect cards as well. Because
it's a good thing to do.
Some of you guys might remember Paul and Margaret Brand, but the same week we get a note slipped under our door from Margaret Brand welcoming us to, encouraging us to continue at Westside.
How much older than you would Margaret Brand have been at that point, do you think?
She might have been
How old would
70.
they be now?
They were retired.
Yeah, they were
so
retired.
She must have been 70, and and we didn't know who they were, but they're famous missionaries, but that was amazing too, and so we started never looked anywhere else. We started coming to Westside. And even walking into the fellowship hall, there was a big map with global. I didn't know much about missionaries at that point in life. And there's this map on the wall with where Westside was supporting missionaries around the world. And Dr. Brand was teaching on his books. And it was an amazing time, but it opened my world to missions. But that's how we came to Westside. And back then, it was 30 years ago.
Yeah, and so it just ended up being so important for what God had purposed, what he was going to will and work in your lives to intersect with this congregation and with the Brands. Would you tell us who Paul, because I think a lot of us here don't know who Paul and Margaret Brand are. So maybe, Leslie, you can tell us who Paul were. They've gone to be with the Lord now, but.
Yes. And as I said before, there are many of you that could share about who Paul and Margaret Brand are better than me, I'm sure, but Margaret was who greeted us at the door every Sunday, and she was like this tall and this big of personality and just love for life and the Lord and everybody that came into her presence, I think. But Paul had grown up as a missionary kid in India, and there's plenty written about his parents, his missionaries from England. His mom was Granny Brand. And he went back to England to study medicine, met Margaret there, and with the desire to go to India. And Margaret actually, I think, was a pediatrician, and when they got to India, they needed an ophthalmologist. So, of course, that's what she became. And so, as missions goes, you think you're going to do this, and God's got this plan. Actually, that's life, isn't it? And Paul he was a surgeon, became a very famous and excellent surgeon, hand surgeon, and was instrumental in understanding that leprosy, we call it Hansen's disease, was the cause of it. Was not actually a skin disease, but more of a neurological disease. And so if you read any of his books, which if you haven't, I would highly encourage that, you just see God's hand. He brings the awe of God into perspective as we look at our bodies and how our bodies work. But he went on to work in Louisiana at the Hansen's Institute. It's basically the leprosy center of the world. And then they retired here. What my understanding was, and we didn't know them, was some of their children were in this area. But
so they came up here.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was there was a time when I was in a fellowship, so I was doing this research project with an orthopedic surgeon over at Harborview, and he says to me, he goes, "Hey, look, we can't meet today because Dr. Brand is doing rounds, and I got to get there early, because if you don't get there early, you can't even hear him." Meaning, he walks around the hospital and talks, and if you're in the back of that big group, you're not going to even hear him. And I said, like, Paul Brand, like Dr. Paul Brand? He goes, "Oh yeah, and he kind of gives a description, and I said, "Oh, I know him." We go to church. Like, I kind of call him a friend. And this guy was like, "Wow." But it was really neat to see, for me to learn how revered, he was in the medical world, and who, because I hadn't read all of his books at that point. We were sitting in Sunday school learning from him and soaking that in, but it's really neat to see his faithfulness to the Lord, really how God used that in medicine in a much larger scope.
Yeah,
and it's always, go ahead, Vic.
Well, they also represented people with professional skills that went to serve the least of these, and that was something that we later went to do, not like they did, but still. And just to say one more thing about him, I still reread his books sometimes. Mm-hmm. And Philip Yancey, who's a pretty famous Christian author, was quoted, and he co-authored with him. He said that Paul Brand gave faith to my words, and he put words to Paul Brand's faith, and Paul Brand gave faith to my words. To
Yancey's words, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, they're just remarkable. And that encouragement, too, that when our vocations meet this commitment to both excelling in whatever our vocation is and excelling in holding out the word of life, that God does amazing things for his name every place, not just within walls of churches or a specific mission field sort of things. Well, there's something else, though, too, Leslie, that happened to you here. You had this mentoring, both of you from the Brands. You ended up in a congregation that is committed to missions, but something even more important happened in Safeway. Was it Safeway?
It was Safeway. Ran into Kim Chamberlain, and it was January of 1995. So we had gotten married in September of 94, and actually had just learned I was pregnant with our first
You wasted no time.
Child. We were 29.
Yeah.
Actually turning 30 that January. So 30 years ago. But ran into Kim, and Kim said, we're going to start up a small group. Would you guys might be interested in joining us? And that conversation, we were just in Safeway last night reflecting on this, actually. That conversation changed our lives in a way that we never could have imagined. And so I am grateful for that invitation. We joined a small group that was Vanderhyde's, Weiss's, McLaughlin's, Chamberlain's, and Folks. And
you're not expected to know all those names.
You may not
and you
know
won't
those
be
names.
tested
Some
on
of
those
them
names.
are still
but all
around.
of them were like young adults, young
our
parents,
age
young
and
marrieds,
stage.
right?
Yeah. There was one kid, Chamberlain's Caleb was the one kid in the group, and that I think it was our very first meeting. We went deep. People shared transparently about the hard things and even the sinful things in their lives. And it was so instructive to us as a young couple how important transparency is and how important community is. And we just were so blessed by that. And that rooted us to this day.
Right.
With those, we just grew. And we only lived here 2 years. This wasn't like decades of being in small group together. This was 2 years. And that was beautiful.
Yeah.
And in that too, Westside is so special to us because we served with the youth. So we were in, touching those generations that were not in any way really a natural part of our lives. We had the parents of our small group around, the Kutzes, the Weisses, just the leadership here. And then the relatives. I remember when Stacy Kutz showed up at our door with a meal when our son was born, and we were embraced. We have no family nearby. And this church, from the old to the young, just welcomed us in and gave us a place of belonging and family.
And that gives some good context of when we could talk about our DNA as a congregation, about how we want to be a place that has those intergenerational friendships. How a lot of us are here without extended family. And to be in places where we can be deeply, transparently known and loved, and to have those connections around, that's exactly what Jesus uses to grow us and equip us and send us. Well, let's fast forward a bit. You're only here for 2 years. You're climbing the corporate ladder. Weyerhaeuser moves you over out to Chicago. You're doing your medical work, but also having babies. You guys have 4 kids by the time. You stop at 4, right? You have 4 kids out.
God stopped us at 4.
And God stopped you at 4. There you go. And then you're working incredibly hard in the management track. I understand, Vic, that even when the first kid was born, and you went back to work that day, right? And so you guys you're working hard.
That's
and
still
then
a
you
sore point, but.
that's still a sore point. Sorry to bring that up. And then David always tells the story. Never mind, I won't go into my husband's
parent leave in that
sore
era.
points. But I think a lot of
father
people
leave.
can relate to, just head down, whatever it is that the job requires, right? But you're still dabbling in kind of going to missions conferences and things like this, checking boxes on cards, right? And then tell us about this story of you ticked a little box that said, oh, sure, we can be talked to about the mission field. And did you have a real encouraging meeting with somebody after that, or how did that go?
Yeah, we landed in a Bible church in the Midwest, and there was a missions conference, and it said, pray for missionaries. Sure, just give us anybody. Again, we have no family, we don't know anybody. We'll pray for whoever needs prayer partners, and go on a mission trip. Vic had actually never been on a mission trip. We're like, yeah, that would be a good thing, because Vic was open, just had never done any of that. And I had done short term. I had not done anything more than a week or 2. And then there was a box that's interested in career missions, and we just checked that thing off, and they were really good. They followed
up. Did both
up.
of you check it off, or did just Leslie check it off?
No,
we probably did it together.
There
We
you
had
go.
talked, but maybe when kids were young or when we were retired, we could go to the mission field. But we
Yeah.
weren't pursuing it at all, really. We just
Right.
checked
Yeah.
the box.
Yeah.
So we had a follow-up meeting with a guy who became a friend. He was a member of the church from SIM. am, huge missions organization. And what I remember, which is probably not true, but is that he had reams and pages of this list of what you have to do to be a career missionary. And I'm sitting there, like, I have no idea what he was saying to us, because I'm looking at this list and thinking, there is no way this is going to happen. Like, all that I thought God had woven in my life to do, I was kind of like, well, I guess I'm just going to keep holding this loosely because I don't see it. No. And so we walked out of that meeting, and it was 5 years later that we went, but we walked out of that meeting and I was like, okay, God, this is not the time, and it's yours.
There's no way this is going to happen. And one of the things wasn't it, you have to tell your employer, what was it, you have to tell your employer?
That you're going to start raising support to go to the mission field, which takes a while. And so we're like, well, if I tell my company I'm going to leave, they'll just tell me to leave tomorrow.
They'll just replace them.
Yeah.
Like, we're not going to sit around and wait for you to leave.
So it just didn't make any sense to us at the time.
But then you had a turn of events. It was actually a pretty rotten turn of events that turned out to be pretty good.
Yeah, which is a life lesson too, because I'd been moving along in Weyerhaeuser and thinking I'll be a Fortune 500 executive at some point in time, and that was my plan. But what I learned was our plans are different than God's plans, because Weyerhaeuser went through some changes. First, I'm asked, do I want to take my boss's job, and but it was a lot of travel, and we just had our fourth kid, and we talked about it and said no. And then a month later,
I wouldn't have survived that.
A guy comes in that I don't know, meet him in O'Hare, and he tells me they're replacing me in my job, and I'm basically being fired. I can either take a severance package or look for a job back at corporate, which was not a bad thing to come back here because our small group was still
here. Our small group's like, just tell us when, we'll help try to find you a place to live, and we're like, oh.
But our missions festival was going, so what came in immediately, what we've been studying at BSF and in Romans, and when I...
BSF is Bible Study Fellowship, yeah.
Sorry.
And God, in the moment I hear this news, God puts in my heart Romans 8:28, that God does all things for the good of those who believe. And so, and I rested in that immediately, like it resonated, well, this is kind of crazy, but maybe God has something really different for us to do right now. And so it happens our missions festival at church.
He called me and actually said that verse, because I was like, those people back at corporate, we need to talk to them. And he's like, God's in this. So it took me a little bit, but I came under his faith.
But our missions festival was going on at our church, and there's people back with Kids Alive from the Dominican Republic that we vaguely knew, and Leslie asked them what we do with you guys, and that started that ball rolling. But really, we just started looking, this is kind of crazy, but what does God want us to do with our lives right now? Mm-hmm. And it was that really shocking chain of events that started that off.
But God would have to do that too, because he loved his work.
Right.
And it needed to be something that was going to just shift and, kind of say, I got something else for you.
Just that interruption. It reminds me, too, just your faith in that, how Paul in the letter to the Philippians is constantly saying, no matter the circumstance, he's so convinced that God's working this for God's purpose, that there is, and not only God's global purpose, but the particular call that God has on Paul's lives, that God had on your lives at that point. So you find yourself then down in the DR, you're doing the medical boom right off the bat on the ground. You're in operations right away. And did it unfold as expected? Were there changes when you got there?
Oh, perfectly smooth. Just like we thought. The people that we knew, that had kind of opened the door to the work there that we thought we were going to do, within a month they were asked to leave. And so they're great people. We remain friends with them. It was not a moral failing. There was some other stuff going on. And that left us kind of, I remember a conversation with a friend who was in the States, who I just had praying. There were a lot of people praying in that time because it was very confusing for us.
You have to wonder, okay, what did we just land in? Did we even get this right?
Exactly, and what are we supposed to do? And there were conversations on the ground among the missionaries that we were working with, what do we do about this? And some were, well, we can take the whole ministry here out of that organization. Like, there were all kinds of conversations that were kind of, and we just felt like flies on the wall, like, whoa.
It's that same unity challenge that we see in Philippians, right? Where Paul's saying, hey, you've got to do this without murmuring and without complaining, because now you've hit a hard thing.
Right.
And you hit a hard thing.
It was. And God, my friend said, you need to remember that God called you there, not that couple. And that was really profound, and that really resonated. And we really needed to seek all these conversations that were happening were not going to be the answer. God had the answer for us and guided us forward through it. And it was painful. And that catapulted Vic into co-leadership of the country, where he's been ever since.
Right.
But that was not really, we were maybe going to move toward that, but not that quickly.
No, not that quickly. And then, isn't it the case that you were going to go for like 3 to 5 years? And then it was 3 to 5 more years?
Right.
And now you've been there 22 years. How much longer are you going to be there?
3 to 5 years.
3 to 5 more years. So in the midst of all of that, right, and these times of hitting genuine hindrances, genuine things that were difficult, I mean, you're people who, for those of us here at Westside, and I know from people here at Westside who've known you for many years, when they describe people who shine like stars because they've continued to move forward without murmuring, without complaining, working out their salvation, working out the hard thing God has with knowing that God's at work, you've been examples and encouragement to people here for that. But I'm curious, on the backside, what has God done in you to empower you, to enable you to keep going in some of these hindrances, in some of these places where continuing to move forward in this call has been a challenge?
I will say, and for those of you who know me, you know that I don't move around perfectly without murmuring or complaining. That would be more his role. But God's grace is good and his forgiveness is great. I think that I remember really clearly, we had that first challenge, and I remember really clearly years after that, there was somebody, we had a going away party that was supposed to be a celebration of a missionary that was leaving, supposed to be very intimate, and there were visitors from a mercy ship that were with one of the missionary families, and they brought them, and I'm like,
are you kidding me?
This is kind of weird. It was at our house. Okay, yes, of course, because everybody, it's always a
You're all missionaries. You're all supposed to be together.
But God, I share this because God is so faithful. It was washing dishes, so because they had no responsibilities and no kids, they stayed late. And we gave them a ride to where they were staying back to our friends' homes later. And I'm standing shoulder to shoulder with this woman because our kitchen was teeny weeny. And she was just asking about how we came and what it had been like and things. And that story about that transition, like that speed bump that we hit that was really painful because there was a lot of personal emotions involved too among people. And I just started crying as she held my heart. And so in odd and crazy ways, God brings people to encourage and to support and to speak truth into our lives and to also listen and reflect him back to us. And that's happened over and over in so many different ways. I remember the first time that people left and vacated a missionary position and there was nobody coming. And these people were in a really critical role and kind of in that, what are we going to do? I don't know how we're going to move through this. I can't take on more work. I don't know how that job's going to happen. And Vic is much more steady and like, it's going to happen. God's going to bring it. God's going to bring it. It's not going to look how we thought it would look. And it's true. It's rarely looked how we thought it would look, but he brings, and it's his work. And, but it is a corporate, the perseverance comes, I think, because we do it together.
Right.
Near and far.
Yeah, I would add, I can think of numerous times we've had a lot of hard things happen and hit bumps. And sometimes they're personal, like we're not sure how we can educate our kids in the developing world, and then God brings a homeschool expert into our life. And then, or Leslie went through breast cancer, and we came back for chemotherapy, and maybe this is it. Maybe we're supposed to be, but God just kept telling us, this is where I want you, and opening doors where they need to be open. And even in the work, there's just things, something happens, it's hard. And you're kind of, I have one of my co-workers who runs one of our schools in the place that Westside sends teams, Caraballo. It's super hard. A lot of Haitians, a lot of discrimination, lots of extreme poverty. We have things happen there. We lose a key employee or something, and we're like, how are we going to go on? But we look back at it now after all these years, and they're like these Red Sea moments where you're just sort of there. We're not sure there's no way out of this one, and then God does something. And we have this, and it's just, and then God did this, and then God did that. And that's happened numerous times to the point that I don't really face I've worked out, it's kind of me working out my own salvation. And that. Like it's my own sanctification. I have more trust in God than ever at this point in my life because I've seen him work in situations that I couldn't find a way through. And
Yeah. And being willing to be in those situations of, okay, this is a place of risk. This is a place I'm not going to be able to see this through by myself, my own effort, my own best efforts, and to see God keep coming through. It's not just, it's both an encouragement to you and encouragement to others who get to hear that story. Because I know we've got parents here concerned about raising their own kids. Or our choices getting in the way of our own kids' education. Health problems, health concerns, health challenges, and to see God come through. Well, we're going to get a chance to hear more about what's happening now in the DR after the service, but we want to give you the final word of, we want to continue to be praying for you. It's so encouraging, and you change our community because you receive our youth and our adult teams that come to you. We're sending another team this summer down to you, and we're so grateful for the way your hospitality in letting us come alongside and work with you. But how can we be, what hopes can we be praying into? How can we be encouraging you from here?
I think one thing I'm going to say prior to asking for things is to say thank you. And some of you may be really new here, and some of you probably, I know, precede us in this church. And this is a really, really special place. You guys most recently, whether you're aware of it or not, I hope you're aware, sent Cooper Guidry down to us, and he came on a youth team. And we remember talking with Stacy. Stacy's been just a force, an advocate, and in contact with us and great encouragement. Lisa West has led teams over years as well, and and there's so many, we could just go on and on. But Cooper, he was in the first service, so I can repeat this because he's already heard it. But when Stacy started talking to us, I remember having I was impressed with a conversation, the sincerity of his faith, in a conversation with him when he was down on the youth team. And then, some part of receiving somebody is being able to care for them. Like, it's not just, oh yeah, come and do this work. We have very few Americans. We are scattered around the country. You are often working in a setting where you're just speaking Spanish, and if you don't speak it well, having that heart language is hard. So part of it is a responsibility that we're deciding, okay, we can take on the care for him, and we don't know how he's going to do. We don't know how much care he's going to need. So we take him on, and he was an amazing blessing. We were so grateful. So I thank any of you and all of you as a corporate church for sending him to us. He was a little bit like you referred to, like Timothy.
Like Timothy was to Paul, right? Just a younger person coming along.
Open hands, open heart. We were like, oh man, there's that. Hey, Cooper could do that. And he did that. We bounced that guy all around the island. But that you think of us and remember us, and the continuing sending of teams and the continuation of support and prayer. I have no idea how prayer works. I know it works. I know God works in it. I know he transforms us through it. But your prayers for us, I know, have guided and directed and paved our path. And we just live in incredible gratitude. It's amazing 30 years later to be able to sit in this church and have the depth of connection and just really gratitude.
Yeah, I can just add, this is not a big church as churches go, but it's a church that has an impact changing kids' lives in the Dominican Republic, whether people know that or not. But we get to be kind of hands and eyes, but this body has been a connection point of support for decades now. And there's thousands of lives that have gotten to know who God is and are thriving are doing better because of the outreach of this church through the missions program, and that just tithing every week, some of that goes to help us live in the Dominican Republic, and this church is it's been so encouraging. I hope we're encouraging to the church body, but this church has been a connection point and a place of love and encouragement for us for all the years. And in Westside, when we did decide to go to the mission field, or God was calling us there, Westside was the first church to step up and support us, even though we were living in Chicago at the time.
Yeah, you guys are a part of, in the outflow of our ministry, we take kids in as little 2, 3, 4-year-olds, preschoolers, and on the backside there are young adults, because we've been there long enough, that are forming stable, Christ-centered, Christ-focused families, and they are pillars in their churches, in their communities, and where they move. And your faithfulness is part of their living out the gospel in their lives, which is, you may not know them by name, but God does, and you have made a very powerful impact in their lives and in the communities where we serve.
Thanks. Let's pray.